This is a download of Farming Today this week from the BBC. For more information and our terms of use, go to www.bbc.co.uk. The presenter today, Charlotte Smith.
Good morning and welcome to the National Trust tent here at the Countryfile Live event at Blenheim Palace. Today on Farming Today this week, we are going to debate rewilding. Is it time to return land to nature? Is it time to bring back beavers, boars and lynx? Well, this is a very controversial subject. Some conservationists argue we should be allowing more of our countryside to revert to its natural state. They'd like to see hill farms replaced by trees, and they'd like to reintroduce long-lost species like the beaver, the lynx, even wolves. Many landowners, however, believe that this could damage the rural economy, push farmers off their fields and ruin their own conservation efforts. So this morning we'll be trying to work out how we balance the needs of farming and the needs of nature. We are joined by a distinguished and expert panel. We have Mike Clark, Chief Executive of the RSPB. Richard Cook is Chairman of the Association of Deer Management, and he's speaking today on behalf of Scottish Land and Estates, which represents the interests of Scottish landowners. And we also have John Davies with us, the Deputy President of NFU Cymru. Now, people here in the tent will realise that the one person we don't yet have is George Monbiot, a writer, a journalist and environmental commentator. He is sadly delayed in the traffic here at Countryfile Live, but we are hoping that he will join us later on. So let's start then by giving each of our panellists 2 minutes to outline their position on rewilding. And we'll start with Mike Clark, Chief Executive of the RSPB.
Rewilding is one of these new debates, but actually captures a number of much more established ideas, but it's bringing out a fresher debate about what should be the future of our countryside. If you look at this from the point of view of a wildlife charity like the RSPB, though, the key test for us is whether this will reverse the declines that we're still seeing continue in our wildlife. You may have heard that the State of Nature report identifies a decline of 60% of our wildlife has been in serious decline over the last half century. And indeed, right now, those species we can measure, 10% are currently heading towards extinction. We have a real crisis. And so rewilding, it's not just simply about bringing back a few iconic species. We need to think about it much more broadly. First and foremost, we need to think about rewilding as reconnecting people with nature. Rewilding is about restoring beneficial habitats for wildlife. It's about bringing back grass-rich meadows so that bumblebees and pollinators can do more for us. And finally, rewilding is about repairing damaged ecosystems. It's about rebuilding natural processes, the way nature works naturally, so ecosystems can function in a healthy way. Clean water for us, capturing carbon.
Thank you very much. Let's now hear from Richard Cook, Chairman of the Association of Deer Management, speaking on behalf of Scottish Land and Estates.
When I started work as a land agent in the mid-1970s, a rather narrow and utilitarian view of what land was for prevailed, and public policy incentivised maximising the production of food, timber and other primary products. There was little talk of the environment. We enthusiastically cut down what we called birch scrub and planted Sitka spruce in its place, drained wetlands with 70% of grant to help us do it, limed moorland and enlarged fields by hedge removal with the best of them. Today grants are available to do exactly the opposite. It is worth reminding ourselves that today's certainties may not stand the test of time. The steady march of environmental awareness has for me personally been an increasingly positive process of change, leading to a growing appreciation of the limits to our natural capital and the constraints this implies for the functional productivity of the land and the delicate balance between resource exploitation and sustainable management. As to where I stand on rewilding, I'm firstly for the people who live and work in the countryside and for ensuring that their livelihoods and the communities where they live are sustained. The land, the environment, needs to be managed, and we need skilled and committed people there to do it.
Let's hear from John Davies, Deputy President of NFU Cymru, farming in the Brecon Beacons.
I'm an upland beef and sheep farmer. It's a beautiful part of the world that I live, and we also farm tourists a little bit as well. It's a job I absolutely love, and it's a real privilege to work in such an environment. And we have to remember that the landscape that we see and enjoy today has been created and maintained by farmers over hundreds of years, really. And we've always understood the multitude of activities that provide these, and they go beyond providing safe, high-quality food to the conventional markets, and they include landscape, clean water, biodiversity and flood migration. I believe that farmers, we deliver multiple benefits, and do so increasingly through agri-environmental schemes, for example. The concept of rewilding with its visions of species reintroduction and land abandonment simply does not. Species introduction harks back to some time in the past where the landscape and population density of the UK was very different, and as a concept it is very much unproven, and there's absolutely no exit strategy if that goes wrong.
This is a very difficult area in which to find any consensus. So let's start with rewilding. We'll come on to reintroducing species in a moment. So Mike, if you were allowed on John's farm, how would you change that farm?
Well, obviously I don't know John's farm. I mean, frankly, I think the first thing to say is I think this is a debate as much about language as anything else. So much of what I was talking about, I was expressing in biological terms. But actually, if you look at that through a farming lens, much of that is talking about how farmers are managing, how they need to, will be managing in the future, and how we can ensure that is optimising in terms of all the benefits they're bringing. So let me give an example. I bet, in Wales, you get a fair bit of rain comes down on the farm. So clearly, as well as the crops and livestock that I imagine John is seeking to produce, he will have runoff from his farm. How he manages that will affect the degree to how rapidly it runs off, what's absorbed as it goes through the ground. All of these things John can produce benefits in terms of clean water, which is part of the natural functioning of that ecosystem John is managing.
But what you would like to do is change the way he manages that ecosystem and farms, because you would like him to have a lot more trees on that land, wouldn't you?
Not necessarily, not at all.
So what's rewilding then, if it isn't putting...
Well, this is the point, Charlotte. This is where we're getting into the semantics and the language, but you have to unpack that. There are natural habitats. If we started with England after the Ice Age, Wales after the Ice Age, there would be habitats that do not have trees because that is their natural state. There will be other habitats that have trees. We've got 10,000 years of modification in this country by humans. We have to work, start with where we are and look at how we get benefits for people and wildlife.
So, John, having heard that, are you less panicked by the idea of rewilding?
Well, rewilding to me can be in many different formats, can't it? We've planted over 4,000 trees. We've planted them across the terrain, okay, so that reduces runoff. I would welcome Mike to come to our farm and witness what runoff. I would say the runoff we have is very, very minimal. We never leave the soil bare over the winter. Yes, we do produce our own crops. We do grow spring barley to produce our top quality Welsh beef. But that's the name of the game. It works in harmony. We can create shelter belts across terrains. There's been some excellent work done in Wales in the Pompren project, and we can look to support and encourage that, and we can work in tandem and together, and I would say incentivise, don't wreck.
I'm delighted to say that, as we were speaking, George Monbiot has sprinted into the tent after what I would imagine is somewhat an epic journey across Countryfile Live here at Blenheim Palace. Thank you very much indeed for doing that. What I'd like to do, everybody else has already done this, if you would just speak for 2 minutes about rewilding, how you see it and why you think it's a good idea.
Sure. Well, you just have to look at a map of Europe, a satellite map versus a satellite map of Britain, to see an extraordinary thing. That while in the rest of Europe, as you would expect, the lowlands, where the land is highly productive, good for farming, is largely bare, in the uplands, and again as you would expect, where the soils are poor, the climate is harsh, the land is largely forested. And that's a great wildlife reserve. It's where the lynx live, and the boar, and the wolves, and the bears, and a great profusion of bird life. You come to Britain, and you see something quite extraordinary, almost unique around the world, which is that the lowlands are largely bare, and the uplands are even barer. There's scarcely a tree above around 200 metres in most of our uplands. And that's not a natural state of the land. That has been created by human beings, or more accurately, by sheep. The uplands of Britain, which you would expect to be our great wildlife reserves, have been comprehensively sheep-wrecked. The sheep alone has done more damage to the living world in Britain than all the building that has ever taken place here, because sheep nibble out tree seedlings, prevent forests from regenerating. Eventually, those forests die away. And our hills were largely forested in the past, and they were our great wildlife refuges. Now, the bare state of the hills is not maintained by any natural economic pressure, because the sheep are maintained at such fantastically low levels, it's almost entirely unproductive. 1 sheep per hectare, 1 sheep per 2 hectares, but that's enough to stop any trees from growing. What maintains them in that state is farm subsidies. We are paying for environmental destruction, for floods downstream, and all the rest, and we could have something so much better.
Richard, you're sitting listening to that. Sheep are a big part of what happens in the uplands. What do you make of that?
My sole area of expertise is actually deer, and in Scotland we're more inclined to hear them blamed for all the damage to the environment than sheep. Although I would say that the last figure that SNH produced of red deer in the Highlands was 275,000, and the equivalent number of sheep at the same time 2 years ago was 2.3 million. So a little bit of perspective is necessary.
That's equivalent figure from Scottish Natural Heritage.
I fully accept that grazing, it doesn't really matter what does it, has been a major engineer of change on the environment. Whether it's good or bad is rather a subjective matter for the people, to some extent, the people who gain a livelihood from sheep or deer or from managing the uplands, and we can't suddenly remove them and leave it all to nature and expect everything to be suddenly all right. I mean, for a start, the first thing that would happen would that the bracken would continue to spread up the hills. Does yours really want bracken everywhere?
What about the people? What about the bracken?
Well, okay, let's start with the bracken. The bracken is an intermediate stage. That is the first stage of succession when the ecosystem starts to recover. And gradually, as I've seen on commons in mid-Wales, for instance, after 20, 30 years, trees start to come through the bracken, rowans, hawthorns and the rest, and then they shade out the bracken, and then gradually you get a transition to forest. So to get hooked up on that sort of temporary state of the land, that's to deceive yourself about what's coming, which is much more interesting and much more diverse. As for people, we absolutely need people. And we absolutely need people to engage in a sustainable living, which, you know, with the end of farm subsidies, sheep farming in the hills patently is not. There'd be no farming in the hills at all were it not for subsidies. So how's that going to work? How are people going to survive? Let's pay them to do something good. Let's pay them to bring back nature, to bring back lively ecological processes, and to see a great restoration as opposed to the destruction there's been so far.
John, you are these people.
Okay, Charlotte, I think it's really important now that we stick to the facts here, and George made a comment there I simply have to correct about there being no trees above 200 metres. My farmhouses are 1,025 foot, just over 300 metres. We will be planting over 4,000 saplings in a tree line to create a new hedge next year. We've already done it. It's been highly successful in the past, just over 400 metres. We've planted thousands of hardwoods, a lovely mix, and it creates a shelter belt where sheep can lamb and cows can calve, and the job just works, you know. And let's just talk about what happens when you don't graze areas. Now, you talk about the Cambrian Mountains, and I've seen some of your writings around that, like Georgian, you'll probably be familiar with the area in Portpyrion, in the demonstration farm in Portpyrion, which has been stock excluded for 40 years. It is a desert of wildlife. It's overtaken by Molinia, and we could go to that spot and we could look at that as an example, and it's very, very disappointing for all sides.
Just very briefly, George, on the facts.
Okay, yeah, well, two things. First of all, I didn't say no trees, I said almost no trees. You look at a satellite map of Britain, you will see that that is true. I'm delighted to hear what John is doing. That's wonderful progress. That does not represent the norm. As for what you say about the Molinia, absolutely. This is why we need people. We have to make some interventions at the beginning of the process, and scarifying the land in order to allow trees to establish. That's essential at the beginning of the process when you've got vegetation like Molinia.
Mike Clark.
I think, you know, this is a debate that with Brexit, the public are being given a stake in some very important principles about what happens to our countryside in the future. I think of the context. When I worked for the RSPB, I was a scientist looking at how open habitats have been maintained since the last ice age, and I can bore for Britain on Molinia.
Please don't.
But what I would say is, we're talking about an ecological context when huge herds of deer and elk and other big mammals could roam across southern England. Open habitats were maintained in a vast mosaic from Oxfordshire here to the Thames estuary. It simply doesn't exist anymore. We have to understand how those things work, but we have to lay it upon a very crowded island with a lot of people actively managing the land and indeed providing a lot of benefit for wildlife in managing that land.
You're listening to Farming Today this week. Today we're discussing the pros and cons of rewilding in a debate being held at Countryfile Live here at Blenheim Palace. And before I open it up to our audience here in our luxurious tent, I just want to have one answer from each of you on this idea of reintroducing species: wolves, lynx, beavers. Starting with you, Mike Clark from the RSPB. What would you reintroduce and why?
Well, one of the key ideas is keystone species. These are species that have a big effect on landscapes. And of the ones you mentioned, I think a very interesting one are beavers, because they produce all kinds of benefits to the water cycle as well as to wildlife. And clearly, all of these things have to be evaluated in terms of impact, but I personally think there's quite a lot of scope for beaver reintroduction.
Richard Cook.
When it comes to reintroductions, I do think we need a much more precautionary approach. Some of the reintroductions we've done have not been as successful as they're made out to be. There are beginning to be issues as to the territorial competition between white-tailed eagles and golden eagles, for example. And in some of the other protected species that we're trying to protect, you have the conflicts between protected pine martens and capercaillie, in which vast amount of money has been spent to try and save the capercaillie. I'm afraid it doesn't look like it's going to be successful. So we really need to sort out how we introduce management when you reach predetermined thresholds, when you're either reintroducing or protecting species, so that we can continue. I know the word manipulate won't be acceptable to everybody, but that's what we do, so that we can manipulate the balance in a way that meets as many of our objectives as possible.
John Davies from the NFU.
I agree with what Robert said there, really, and I think it's really important we use a great degree of pragmatism before we have species reintroduction, and we ensure that there is an exit strategy if we do. And if you're asking for one species, well, I'm thinking about England now, of course. I'd encourage you to reintroduce the red kite, and failing that, you'd be very welcome to come and stay with us and have a good look at them in the heart of Mid Wales.
George Monbiot, what would you reintroduce?
I would reintroduce as many species as is politically, publicly acceptable. We have to do it with consent, we have to bring people round to the idea, but I want an ecosystem which is as rich and enchanting and wonderful as we can possibly have in this country, because we deprive ourselves otherwise. Think of the wonders that are excluded from this country and the richness of human experience that is excluded as a result. So let's go for everything that the public will accept.
Let's hear from our audience.
Hi, Tom Beckett from the Berks, Bucks and Oxon Wildlife Trust. I suppose one of my questions is, in perspective with rewilding landscapes, is it might make them a little bit less accessible. We have a very populated island. I think that it's exceptionally important that people can go out and engage with wildlife within our country, more because they're going to change their opinions on the environment and getting involved with the environment. How does rewilding of wildlife and landscapes really kind of allow for people to be able to engage in it?
Well, you only have to go walking in France or Italy or Germany or Slovenia or Romania to see the answer to that. There are abundant paths through these rich, rich habitats which then take you up to viewpoints where you can see across miles and miles of wonderful, rich ecosystems. It doesn't stop anyone from going through, it just creates a much richer and more engaging and delightful environment for those who visit, and the chance of seeing some really spectacular wildlife. What's not to like about that?
Richard.
On the Heather Moorland I manage, we did a full audit last year, and we counted 82 species of birds. This was incidentally to ensure that we got our agricultural subsidy. 82 species of birds, of which we had 10 birds of prey, including red kites, and 8 species of nesting wadder. And that diversity is associated with intensive grouse management, and I use the word intensive advisedly. Now, that Heather Moorland is also a precious habitat in Britain, and that is the habitat which most quickly offers opportunities for recolonisation by regenerating trees, and we have lots of examples of that. How do you decide which is the prior habitat?
Thank you. John, did you want to say something here?
I'm just thinking we've got to have a little bit of practicality into the debate, and you know, we really welcome tourists, and we have a number of trails where they're welcome to go around, etc. But obviously you have to have a safe experience as well. I'm thinking back to that farmer in the heart of Mid Wales that left the sign at a gate which I didn't agree with, of course. He said, my bull can cross it in 12 seconds, don't enter unless you can do it in 10. Well, you know, we talk about engagement with wolves, etc. You know, I don't know if I want to be that engaged with one chasing my family, but there we are. That's just me.
Let's move on to another question.
Rob York, I'm an independent rural surveyor. Can I hear suggestions from everyone how to get money into the uplands to enable land managers to move forward in a new era?
Which is going to be key, isn't it, particularly as we move forward after a Brexit into new agricultural policies for the different nations. If you're wondering what the noise is, that we are in a tent here at Countryfile Live, and it is a little bit windy. Don't worry, it's not going anywhere. It just makes this noise to unsettle everybody. So apologies for the rather loud creaking. George Monbiot, where would you look for money?
Well, it's clear that the current subsidy regime is going to be unsustainable in Britain. £3 billion a year we're paying farmers, which is roughly the same as the NHS deficit. And now that we can't hide behind the European Union anymore and say, oh, it's all the EU's fault, people are going to compare those figures and say, what are we giving this money away for? Now, I'm not against the principle of farm subsidies, but we should be subsidising good things, not bad things. And that means paying public money for the restoration of our broken ecosystems, paying public money to bring back a far richer and more diverse wildlife than we have at the moment, and a far richer experience for human beings as well. And that means keeping farmers on the land, but asking them to do something different on that land. And I think it could be about the only thing that will keep farmers on the land.
John Davies from NFU Cymru.
Okay, well, let's just evolve this to Wales now. You know, the budget in Wales for NHS, has been mentioned, takes up 45% of the Welsh budget. The whole farm support figure for Wales is less than 3%, so I think we deliver reasonably good value for money there. I think in the future now, that comes around to the challenge, okay, because what we've had to do with farm subsidies in the past has been to implement. Now we've got a clean sheet of paper and we can create. Now that's a big challenge because we've had nobody in DEFRA, nobody in the Welsh Government that has been doing that for the last 30 years. When it comes to trade negotiations, absolutely vital when it comes to getting money to the rural economy of Wales, that we get access to the marketplace, because without access to the marketplace, it's going to be a real challenge. So obviously access to the marketplace, number one, that's how you sustain the rural economy of Wales, that's how you sustain the language, that's how you sustain the rural communities. Number two, I think we need to be a little bit more innovative. We need to look at schemes where we get mixed graze into the uplands so that it does a little bit of damage to some of the places and it is a better environment for insects and the like, you know. So we need to ensure that we don't have monoculture. So, you know, we need to look at complementary ways of working together that will solve problems for the whole of the public. And we need to have that debate and we welcome it.
First of all, the existing cake, we were asked where's more money. I mean, there's £3 billion in the existing cake, and I think we do need to look at how that's divided broadly between that which is direct payments and that which is encouraging a whole wide range of other benefits that good farming does produce, clean water, wildlife and so on. And I would like to see some reassurance from the Treasury that they are going to honour and underpin the existing schemes while we're in transition.
Mike Clark from the RSPB there. Let's move on.
Hi, my name's Rowena Smuts and I'm from South Africa. I grew up on a farm close to the Kruger National Park, and I was very lucky to go and spend many childhood holidays visiting the Kruger National Park. And there's absolutely nothing more exciting than actually being on foot with game. It's something that you can't replicate. I'm also a keen hiker and I've hiked a lot in Scotland and over Britain recently. And you've got some really stunning spaces to visit and enjoy and beautiful mountains. But I must say, there always feels to me like there's something missing. And there just isn't much wildlife here. And I think Britain could learn a lot from South Africa in this regard.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? We expect people in Africa to live alongside lions and buffalo and hippos, and we get very upset if those animals get killed, and we launch campaigns in this country saying, don't kill the rhinos, don't kill the elephants, don't kill the lions, and all the rest of it. And yet, We hear people saying, oh, we can't have beavers, that's far too scary, you can't expect us to live alongside them, and boar and lynx and wolves, that's far too much to expect of anyone. Well, we can live alongside wildlife. In fact, as the African experience, especially the South African experience shows, you can live alongside far more scary and interesting wildlife than what we're talking about for rewilding in Britain.
It's a subject we're going to come back to on Farming Today and also on Countryfile. Thank you all very much indeed for your time. That's it from us here in the rather warm National Trust tent at Countryfile Live at Blenheim Palace.